The German Wehrmacht that unleashed blitzkrieg upon Europe in 1939 was not a monolithic, mechanized juggernaut as popular history often portrays. It was, instead, a force of stark and deliberate contrasts, built upon a military doctrine that prized tactical brilliance and operational audacity above all else. This philosophy, honed in the aftermath of World War I, created an army that could achieve breathtaking victories but was fundamentally ill-equipped for a prolonged war of attrition against industrial powers. The German generals who would later scoff at American logistics were products of this system, a system that viewed war as an art form for masters, not a contest of brute force supply. The heart of German operational thinking was Bewegungskrieg, the war of movement. Unlike the static trench warfare of the previous generation, this doctrine emphasized speed, encirclement, and the paralyzing shock of concentrated force. The Panzer Division was its ultimate expression, a combined arms force designed to punch through enemy lines and race deep into the rear, severing supply lines, disrupting communications, and sowing chaos. Command was decentralized, granting immense initiative to junior officers on the ground, who were trained to recognize and exploit fleeting opportunities, the famous Auftragstaktik. This system produced commanders of legendary tactical skill, men like Erwin Rommel and Heinz Guderian, who could orchestrate battlefield symphonies that left their opponents disoriented and defeated. However, this exquisite tactical instrument was built on a fragile logistical foundation. German industry, while advanced, was not structured for the mass production that would characterize the American war effort. Manufacturing was often artisanal, focusing on quality over quantity. The Tiger tank was a masterpiece of engineering, but it was complex, expensive, and time-consuming to build. A single Tiger could defeat several Sherman tanks in a head-on engagement, but the United States could produce 10 Shermans for every Tiger that rolled out of a German factory. This emphasis on qualitative superiority created a Panzer Zoo of different models, Tigers, Panthers, Panzer IVs, each with unique and often non-interchangeable parts, complicating maintenance and supply in the field. This logistical brittleness was exacerbated by a critical underestimation of what a modern army consumed. The German High Command, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKW, planned for short, decisive campaigns. Blitzkrieg was designed to win wars in weeks, not years. Their logistical tails were consequently short. The army was still largely dependent on horse-drawn transport for its supplies. For every panzer division, there were thousands of horses hauling ammunition, food, and fuel. This created a fatal mismatch. A strategy built on lightning speed was powered by a supply system moving at a walk. When the invasion of the Soviet Union stalled before Moscow in the winter of 1941, the entire system broke down. Trucks designed for Western European roads succumbed to the mud and cold, spare parts were non-existent, and fuel convoys were stretched over thousands of vulnerable miles. It was from this context, a culture of brilliant tactics hamstrung by chronic logistical shortages, that the German disdain for American military prowess emerged. Having fought the Red Army, which often won through sheer mass and willingness to absorb catastrophic losses, and having witnessed the early, clumsy performances of Green American troops in North Africa and Italy, German commanders developed a profound sense of operational superiority. They saw American tactics as rigid and predictable, their leadership as cautious and uninspired. They mocked the Sherman tank as a Ronson for its tendency to catch fire, a crude and inferior weapon compared to their own armored beasts. Most of all, they scoffed at the American reliance on seemingly endless material. To the German staff officer, schooled in the art of maximizing limited resources, this appeared as a crutch for a lack of martial skill. They believed no amount of trucks, fuel, or rations could compensate for inferior command and a soft civilian soldier. They were masters of fighting with scarcity. The idea that an enemy would build an entire army around the principle of overwhelming supply was, to them, tactically vulgar. They were convinced that when this American logistical behemoth met the hard reality of war, when its long supply lines were severed by a masterful panzer thrust, it would collapse under its own weight, its soldiers demoralized by their dependence on comforts they could no longer receive. This arrogance was the great German blind spot. They had spent years learning how to fight a war with not enough of everything. They had never conceived of an enemy whose fundamental strategy was to ensure it always had more than enough of everything. They were prepared to fight a duel of fencers. They were utterly unprepared for a contest against a foe who intended to win by burying them under an avalanche of steel, gasoline, and determination. The stage was set for a clash not just of armies, but of diametrically opposed philosophies of war. The German generals laughed, confident in their mastery of the battle map. They did not yet understand that the Americans were playing a different game entirely, one where the most important movements happened not at the front, but hundreds of miles behind it, on roads soon to be choked with the unending, rolling thunder of the Red Ball Express. While the German Wehrmacht perfected the art of the battlefield blitz, a different, for more profound kind of blitz was gathering force across the Atlantic. It was not a blitz of panzers and Stukas, but one of molten steel, assembly lines, and raw industrial will. The United States, a nation still grappling with the Great Depression in the late 1930s, was about to undergo the most dramatic economic and industrial transformation in human history. This was the awakening of their arsenal of democracy, a mobilization so vast and efficient that it would redefine the very nature of modern warfare, shifting the decisive factor from tactical genius to logistical and industrial supremacy. The American philosophy of war was the antithesis of the German model. Where Germany sought qualitative perfection for short, decisive campaigns, America embraced a doctrine of quantitative overwhelm for a long war of attrition. The core belief was simple, brutal, and rooted in the nation's character. No enemy could withstand the endless, tidal wave of material that American industry could generate. This was not seen as a substitute for courage or skill, but as their essential prerequisite. A well-fed, well-equipped soldier, supplied with ample ammunition and supported by endless streams of vehicles and aircraft, was a soldier who could win. The goal was not to outfight the enemy, but to outproduce him to the point where his ability to resist collapsed under the weight of American plenty. The catalyst for this awakening was the fall of France in 1940. The sight of a modern European army collapsing in weeks sent a shockwave through the American establishment. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, with foresight that bordered on prescience, began the mobilization even before the United States was formally in the war. The Lend-Lease Act of 1941 was the opening salvo, turning the U.S. into the workshop for its future allies. But it was the attack on Pearl Harbor that threw the switch on the national grid, converting the entire industrial complex to a war footing with a speed and unity that stunned the world. The statistics of this mobilization remain staggering, even decades later. Automobile plants that once built Chevrolets and Chryslers were retooled almost overnight. The Ford Motor Company's colossal Willow Run plant was conceived to produce a B-24 Liberator bomber every hour. And it did. By 1944, it was rolling a finished bomber off its mile-long assembly line every 63 minutes. Henry Kaiser's shipyards applied assembly line techniques to naval construction, reducing the time to build a Liberty ship from 365 days to a mere 42. At its peak, a new Liberty ship was being launched every single day. This was not merely production, it was the industrialization of creation itself. The centerpiece of this land-based arsenal was the truck. The U.S. Army standardized a few rugged, reliable models that could be mass-produced and easily maintained. The workhorses were the Dodge WC Series, the GMC CCKW, and the legendary Jeep. The GMC Juice and a Half, 2.5-ton truck, became the backbone of Allied logistics. Its design was simple, its components interchangeable, and it was built in the hundreds of thousands. American factories produced over 800,000 military trucks during the war, a number that dwarfed the German output. This was the unglamorous, essential hardware that would make the American way of war possible. While the German army relied on looted French cars and a chaotic menagerie of horse-drawn carts, the U.S. Army was building a standardized, fully motorized logistical fleet. This industrial miracle was powered by a social revolution. Millions of men entered the armed forces, and millions of women, symbolized by Rosie the Riveter, entered the factories. They were not just replacing men, they were achieving levels of production previously thought impossible. The war effort demanded and received the collective effort of an entire nation, from the steel mills of Pittsburgh to the aluminum plants of the Pacific Northwest. The American economy, once dormant, was now running at a fever pitch, its output greater than that of all the Axis powers combined. The German generals, observing from a distance, fundamentally misread this phenomenon. They saw the early Sherman tanks and American equipment as proof of their qualitative superiority. They dismissed the American focus on mass production as evidence of a crude, materialistic culture that could not understand the finer points of war. They believed that such a system would produce inferior weapons manned by soldiers who lacked the hardened, martial spirit of the Wehrmacht. They failed to grasp the strategic implication. The United States was not building a single, perfect weapon. It was building an ecosystem of war. It was creating a system where a tank lost in combat was not a tragedy, but a statistic, because 2 more were already on a ship crossing the Atlantic. It was creating an army that would not run out of bullets, beans, or gasoline. The arsenal of democracy was not just producing weapons, it was producing certainty. It was the foundation upon which the entire Allied war effort was built, and it was about to meet the ancient battlefields of Europe with a force that the German doctrine, for all its tactical elegance, had no answer to. The workshops were awake. The flood was coming. June 6, 1944, stands in history as a masterpiece of amphibious assault, a day of unparalleled courage and meticulous planning that cracked open Hitler's fortress Europe. The landings on the beaches of Normandy were a triumph of Allied coordination and raw bravery. But as the sun set on that momentous day, a new and far more complex battle began, a battle not against German soldiers, but against the immutable laws of physics, geography, and mathematics. The success of D-Day had created the greatest logistical nightmare in the history of warfare. They had successfully forced open the front door, but now they were trapped in the doorway, and the entire house was threatening to collapse from within under the sheer weight of its own needs. The initial plan, while ambitious, was predicated on a methodical, phased expansion of the beachhead. The Allies would secure the landing zones, quickly capture the deep-water port of Cherbourg, and then build up supplies for a massive breakout. But the plan began to fray almost immediately. The bocage country of Normandy, a dense, ancient patchwork of small fields surrounded by towering, impenetrable hedgerows anchored on earthen banks, became a defender's paradise. Every hedge concealed a German machine gun nest or a Panzerfaust team. The American, British, and Canadian advance, measured in yards and paid for in blood, was agonizingly slow. The front line stagnated, creating a terrible congestion. The armies were not breaking out, but they were still growing, consuming thousands of tons of supplies every day without gaining the territory needed to ease the logistical strain. The failure to capture Cherbourg quickly and intact was a catastrophic blow. The German garrison, following Hitler's orders, fought to the last man and systematically demolished the port facilities, scuttling ships in the harbor and rendering the docks useless. It would take months of Herculean effort by American engineers to restore even a fraction of its capacity. This left the Allies with an impossible problem: how to supply a modern, mechanized army of over 1 million men through 2 artificial harbors and open beaches. The Mulberry harbors were engineering marvels, but they were fragile ones. The American Mulberry, at Omaha Beach, was destroyed by a freak storm on June 19, a devastating event that wiped out over 800 vessels and set the supply effort back by weeks. While the British Mulberry B at Arromanches continued to function, its capacity was a mere trickle compared to the Army's thirst. The fallback was the Herculean effort of drying out LSDs, landing ship, tank, at low tide and driving supplies directly onto the sand, a process known as Operation Duck. It was slow, vulnerable to weather, and chaotic. Mountains of crates, known as dragon's teeth, piled up on the beaches, creating a target-rich environment for German artillery and a bureaucratic quagmire for supply officers. The numbers were staggering and told the story of a system on the verge of seizure. By late July, the Allies had put over 1.5 million men and 300,000 vehicles ashore. Their daily requirement was over 40,000 tons of supplies. They were receiving barely a third of that. The priorities were absolute: ammunition and fuel. Everything else was a luxury. Units found themselves immobilized, not by the enemy, but by empty gas tanks. The U.S. First Army was like a powerful engine, its cylinders flooded with men and machines, but its fuel line was kinked. The great, mechanized force that was meant to race across France was instead stuck in the Norman mud, consuming its own supplies just to exist. This was the moment the German generals had smugly predicted. This was the point where, in their doctrine, the offensive would stall. They watched the traffic jams on the beaches from a distance and saw confirmation of their beliefs. The Americans were logistically incompetent, their army a clumsy giant that could not function without its umbilical cord to the United States. They believed a single, sharp counterattack would snap that cord and send the entire Allied expedition into a panicked rout, just as they had done to overextended enemies in the past. What they failed to understand was that the American system, for all its apparent chaos, possessed a dynamic capacity for adaptation that the rigid German command structure could not comprehend. The crisis on the beaches was not a sign of impending collapse, it was the painful, necessary labor preceding a new kind of birth. The very same industrial mindset that had built an arsenal of democracy was now being applied to the problem of distribution. The Americans did not see a nightmare, they saw a problem to be solved with trucks, organization, and sheer, unrelenting will. The congestion on the beaches was the pressure building behind a dam. All it needed was a crack in the German line to be released in a torrent that would sweep across France. That crack was about to be punched at Saint-Lô, and the torrent had a name, Operation Cobra, and the Third Army of General George S. Patton. The nightmare was real, but the American response would be a waking dream of logistical audacity. While the U.S. First Army hammered relentlessly against the stubborn German defenses in the Norman Bocage, a different kind of force waited in the wings, simmering with pent-up energy. This was the Third Army, activated on August 1, 1944, and its commander was Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr., a figure who embodied offensive warfare with a near-mythological intensity. Patton was not merely a general, he was a prophet of movement, a believer in the decisive, war-winning power of relentless advance. His philosophy was simple, brutal, and elegant: hold M by the nose and kick M in the pants. The First Army was the nose-holder, grinding down the enemy in a brutal war of attrition. Patton's Third Army was designed to be the kick, a lightning-fast, deep-penetrating thrust that would unhinge the entire German front in France. But in early August, this magnificent, thirsty beast was stalled, not by the enemy, but by an even more implacable foe, a critical shortage of gasoline. Patton's entire doctrine was built around speed and shock. He understood that the true weapon was not the tank itself, but the paralyzing momentum of an entire armored column moving with unexpected velocity. His plans were not for modest gains of a few miles, but for sweeping encirclements of entire armies. He envisioned his column slicing through the brittle German rear areas, seizing bridges intact, and collapsing the enemy's command and supply structure from within. The Third Army was the perfect instrument for this. It was a fully mechanized force, a complex organism of tanks, half-tracks, self-propelled artillery, and trucks, all designed to move and fight at a pace the Germans could no longer match after years of attrition. The opportunity for this decisive blow came with the success of Operation Cobra in late July, when a massive aerial bombardment blew a hole in the German lines near Saint-Lô. The First Army's breakout began, and Patton's Third Army was unleashed into the breach. The results were spectacular. While the British and Canadians pinned down German panzer divisions around Caen, Patton's forces exploded into the open country of Brittany and then, in a breathtaking pivot, swung eastward into the undefended underbelly of the German position in France. Towns that had taken weeks to capture in the Bocage were now falling in hours. The advance was measured not in yards, but in tens of miles per day. The German Seventh Army was in danger of being completely encircled. But this very success became the source of Patton's torment. Every mile of advance stretched his supply lines thinner. Every tank, every truck, every jeep in his voracious army guzzled gasoline. The Third Army was a beast with an insatiable appetite for fuel. Its daily requirement was staggering, over 400,000 gallons of gasoline to operate at peak offensive capacity. And the fuel was not there. The logistical system, already strained to its absolute limit supplying the First Army's brutal fight, was now being asked to feed a new, even more ravenous army that was advancing at a rate no one had thought possible. The supply chain was a fragile, 1,000-mile thread stretching from the factories in America, across the Atlantic on vulnerable tankers, through the damaged Mulberry harbors and onto the clogged beaches of Normandy, onto trucks for transfer to forward depots, and finally onto more trucks for the journey to the front. Patton's rapid advance meant that the truck convoys had to travel ever-increasing distances on roads still vulnerable to German snipers and bypassed pockets of resistance. The system was breaking under the strain of its own success. Patton became a man possessed, his famous temper flaring not at the Germans, but at his own supply officers. He cajoled, begged, and threatened for more fuel. He famously ordered his units to siphon gasoline from anything that wasn't bolted down, including the fuel reserves of other, less favored units. His army began to operate like a giant, mechanized parasite, scavenging for the precious liquid that meant the difference between motion and paralysis. Tanks sat idle by the roadside, their engines silent, their crews fuming with frustration. The Great Blitzkrieg, the American-style lightning war, was sputtering to a halt not from enemy action, but from emptiness. This was the moment of supreme irony and agonizing frustration. The German army in western France was reeling, off balance, and ripe for annihilation. The path to the German border, and potentially to an early end to the war, seemed open. Patton, with his unparalleled instinct for the enemy's weakness, could smell victory. He knew that a pause, however brief, would allow the Germans to recover, to bring up reserves, and to establish a new defensive line. The war of movement would once again degenerate into a bloody, static slog. His thirsty beast was on the verge of the kill, but its muscles were locking up, deprived of the essential fluid that gave it life. The greatest American offensive of the war was stalling within sight of its goal, and the solution would require not a tactical genius, but a logistical miracle. The beast was stalled, and its roar was becoming a groan of desperation. The crisis of August 1944 represented a fundamental paradox of the Allied campaign in France. They had achieved the seemingly impossible, a successful amphibious invasion and a dramatic breakout, only to be threatened with defeat by their own success. The command posts of the 12th Army Group, led by General Omar Bradley, and the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, under General Dwight D. Eisenhower, were filled not with the euphoria of victory, but with the tense, grim atmosphere of a high-stakes calculation. They were facing a battle that could not be won with bullets or bravery, but only with gasoline and groceries. The order that emerged from this pressure cooker was as simple to state as it was monumental to execute: create a lifeline from thin air. They had to invent, almost overnight, a logistics system capable of feeding Patton's blitz. The problem was a perfect storm of Allied success and German demolition. The front lines had advanced over 200 miles in a matter of weeks, but the supply bases remained anchored to the Normandy beaches, now nearly a week's round trip for a truck. The Germans had systematically destroyed every major port along the French coast, making seaborne supply impossible. The existing supply system, known as the Communications Zone, or COMZ, was a bureaucratic, plodding organization, utterly unprepared for the frantic pace of a pursuit. Its commander, General John C. H. Lee, was a competent administrator but lacked the audacity and flexibility the situation demanded. The system was choking, and Patton's Third Army was the patient turning blue. The man thrust into the center of this maelstrom was General Dwight D. Eisenhower. As Supreme Commander, his role was to balance the competing ambitions of his star generals, Montgomery's drive toward the Low Countries and Patton's thrust toward the Saar, with the cold, hard reality of what his supply lines could bear. The arguments were fierce. Patton, in his characteristic, flamboyant style, demanded all available fuel, promising a swift end to the war if only he could keep moving. He argued that to stop was criminal, that the opportunity to destroy the German army in the West would not come again. But Eisenhower had to see the bigger picture. He could not starve the First Army and the northern thrust to feed Patton's southern offensive. The solution was not to choose one over the other, but to find a way to supply them all. The existing system was failing. A new one had to be built, and it had to be built now, with the tools at hand. There would be no time for committees, no time for perfect planning. It would be an act of pure, desperate improvisation on a grand scale. Their impossible order was not a single directive, but a mandate for radical action. It was given to the Transportation Corps of COMZ, but its execution would require the entire army. The concept was breathtakingly simple in theory and staggeringly complex in practice: suspend all other non-essential logistics, dedicate every available truck, and create a closed-loop, high-speed conveyor belt running from the beaches of Normandy directly to the advancing fronts. This would not be a normal supply route, it would be a military operation in its own right, an express highway for material, insulated from the normal traffic and bureaucracy of the war. The parameters of the miracle were defined by brutal necessity. The system had to achieve a minimum daily delivery of 75,000 tons of supplies to the forward depots. It had to operate 24 hours a day, in all weather, and be protected from enemy interference. It had to be organized with the precision of a military assault, with its own dedicated military police, mechanics, and traffic control. The lifeline would have to run on wheels, and nothing else. There were no rails, no pipelines, no ports. It was trucks or nothing. The pressure from the front was immense. Daily, sometimes hourly, reports came in from Patton's headquarters, detailing the dwindling fuel reserves of his divisions. His messages grew more desperate, his language more colorful. He was a racer watching his opponent pull away while his own car sat in the pits. The entire Allied High Command understood the stakes. If they could not solve this problem, the war in Europe would drag on for months, even another year, costing countless more lives. The German army, given a respite, would fortify the Siegfried Line and the Rhine River, turning the conflict into the very war of attrition they had hoped to avoid. The order to create this lifeline was an admission that pre-war planning had met the chaotic reality of war and lost. It was a leap of faith, a bet that the same American ingenuity that had built the arsenal of democracy could now, in a matter of days, devise a way to deliver its products to the battlefield at an unprecedented rate. It was a decision born of crisis, a recognition that sometimes, to win a war, you must first win the battle of supply. The command was given. The resources were, in theory, available. Now, it fell to a corps of truck drivers, mechanics, and military policemen to perform the impossible. They would call their miracle the Red Ball Express. The crisis of August 1944 represented a fundamental paradox of the Allied campaign in France. They had achieved the seemingly impossible, a successful amphibious invasion and a dramatic breakout, only to be threatened with defeat by their own success. The command posts of the 12th Army Group, led by General Omar Bradley, and the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, under General Dwight D. Eisenhower, were filled not with the euphoria of victory, but with the tense, grim atmosphere of a high-stakes calculation. They were facing a battle that could not be won with bullets or bravery, but only with gasoline and groceries. The order that emerged from this pressure cooker was as simple to state as it was monumental to execute: create a lifeline from thin air. They had to invent, almost overnight, a logistics system capable of feeding Patton's blitz. The problem was a perfect storm of Allied success and German demolition. The front lines had advanced over 200 miles in a matter of weeks, but the supply bases remained anchored to the Normandy beaches, now nearly a week's round trip for a truck. The Germans had systematically destroyed every major port along the French coast, making seaborne supply impossible. The existing supply system, known as the Communications Zone, or COMZ, was a bureaucratic, plodding organization, utterly unprepared for the frantic pace of a pursuit. Its commander, General John C. H. Lee, was a competent administrator but lacked the audacity and flexibility the situation demanded. The system was choking, and Patton's Third Army was the patient turning blue. On August 25, 1944, the Allied High Command issued the formal directive that would transform a desperate concept into a tangible, roaring reality. It was designated Truck Operation Red Ball, a name borrowed from railroad terminology for a high-priority, express freight shipment. From its very inception, it was conceived not as a mere supply route, but as a full-scale military offensive in its own right, a battle against time, distance, and the physical limits of men and machines. The Red Ball Express was not born in a staff college textbook, it was forged in the white-hot urgency of a fleeting opportunity, a temporary, brutal solution to an existential crisis. The plan was a masterpiece of brute-force logistics. It created a dedicated, closed-loop highway system running from the massive supply dumps around Saint-Lô and Chartres to the advancing front lines, which by late August were pushing toward the Seine River and beyond. The route was marked with distinctive red ball signs, warning all other military traffic to keep off. This was to be an artery, and nothing could be allowed to obstruct its flow. The rules governing its operation were as strict as those for a combat mission. Convoys would move at a constant 35 miles per hour, maintaining a 60-yard interval between trucks. They would have the right of way over all other vehicles, including the staff cars of generals. The route was one way only, loaded trucks racing eastward on the Red Ball Highway, empty trucks returning westward on a parallel, return road. There were no U-turns, no exceptions. The scale of the mobilization was breathtaking. Within 48 hours of the order being given, over 6,000 trucks were commandeered from every unit that could spare them. They were primarily the legendary GMC CCKW 2.5-ton trucks, their juice and a half, along with larger 10-ton Max and a smattering of every other available model. These vehicles were stripped from their regular duties, their drivers and mechanics pulled from their parent units and thrown into this new, frantic enterprise. The human core of the Red Ball was equally hastily assembled. Of the approximately 75,000 men who would ultimately serve in the operation, a staggering 75% were African American. In the segregated American Army of World War II, black soldiers were largely relegated to service units, quartermaster, transportation, and engineer battalions. The Red Ball Express would become their front line. The operation began not with a ceremony, but with the roar of 1,000 engines turning over at once. The first convoys rolled out on August 25. A river of olive drab flowing east. The initial goal was to deliver 75,000 tons of supplies in the first 5 days. They would soon shatter that target. The system operated with relentless, 24-hour intensity. Drivers worked in shifts, but the trucks never stopped. At breakdown points along the route, teams of mechanics worked around the clock in open-air pits, performing miracles of repair with limited parts. A truck with a blown engine or a broken axle was not towed, it was simply pushed off the road to be cannibalized for parts, its cargo hastily transferred to another vehicle. The priority was the cargo, not the truck. Speed and volume were all that mattered. The drivers of the Red Ball Express were not truckers, they were combat logisticians operating in a hostile environment. The routes were not fully secured. German snipers, bypassed in the rapid advance, still lurked in woods along the roads, taking potshots at the endless line of tempting targets. The threat of air attack was constant, though the Luftwaffe was a diminished force. The greatest enemy was fatigue. Drivers fought to stay awake at the wheel for 18, 20, sometimes 22 hours at a stretch, fueled by coffee, cigarettes, and amphetamine-based energy tablets issued by the army. They drove through darkness, their blackout headlights offering only a dim glow, navigating by the faintly visible Red Ball placard on the truck in front of them. A moment's lapse in concentration could mean a deadly crash, causing a chain reaction pileup that would halt the entire expressway for hours. Yet, they drove on. They developed their own culture, their own rules of the road. They decorated their trucks with names and pin-up girls. They learned to ignore the official speed limit, pushing their heavily laden juice and a halves to their mechanical limits, knowing that every minute saved meant gasoline reaching a stranded tank battalion at the front sooner. The military police of the Rolling 20 Battalion became legends themselves, not for handing out tickets, but for keeping this frantic, high-speed torrent flowing, clearing wrecks and directing traffic with a ruthless efficiency that brooked no argument. The Red Ball Express was a temporary, emergency measure, originally planned to last just a few weeks. But its impact was immediate and profound. In its first week of operation, it was delivering over 12,000 tons of supplies per day to the front. It was the literal fuel for Patton's continued advance. Every gallon of gasoline that allowed a Sherman tank to roll toward the Meuse, every round of 75mm ammunition that enabled an artillery battery to support an infantry attack, every K-ration that fed a weary soldier, a significant portion of it now traveled on the Red Ball Highway. It was a noisy, dusty, exhausting, and dangerous miracle, a testament to what could be achieved when organization met desperation. The lifeline had been created from thin air, and it was now pumping the lifeblood of the Allied advance directly into the heart of the battlefield. The relentless, roaring river of the Red Ball Express was powered by a profound and painful irony. The men who kept the American war machine moving, who delivered the very means of victory to the front lines, were themselves denied the freedoms they were fighting to secure for others. Of the nearly 75,000 men who served in this colossal logistical effort, an estimated 70 to 75% were African American soldiers serving in segregated quartermaster and transportation corps units. They were the unsung heroes of the Allied breakout, operating in a system that demanded their supreme effort while offering them second-class citizenship in the army they served. The United States Army they enlisted in was an institution governed by the racist doctrine of separate but equal. Black soldiers were largely barred from combat roles in the infantry, armor, and artillery, based on the prejudiced belief that they lacked the courage, intelligence, and discipline for frontline fighting. Instead, they were funneled into service units, where they were tasked with the backbreaking, unglamorous, but utterly vital work of manual labor, stevedores unloading ships, engineers building roads, and drivers hauling supplies. The Red Ball Express became the largest concentration of their efforts, a monumental task built on their shoulders. For these men, the motivation to excel was complex and deeply personal. Many saw their service as a double victory campaign, a fight against fascism abroad and a fight against racism at home. By performing their duties with unparalleled skill and endurance, they aimed to prove their worth, to shatter the stereotypes that confined them, and to stake a claim to the full rights of citizenship they were denied. A driver from the 3903rd Quartermaster Truck Company expressed a common sentiment: "We knew what we were doing was important. We were proving something. Every truckload that got through was a bullet against Hitler and an argument for our own freedom." Their working conditions were brutal. While white officers typically held the command positions, the black enlisted men bore the physical burden. They loaded and drove the trucks, repaired them under fire, and maintained the relentless schedule. A standard run from the Normandy depots to the front lines near Chartres or Paris could be a 300-mile, 36-hour round trip. Drivers operated on little sleep, navigating treacherous, often unmarked roads in blackout conditions. The threat of accident was ever present. Worn-out brakes on a fully loaded 10-ton truck descending a hill could be a death sentence. The threat from the enemy was equally real. German snipers and roving bands of bypassed troops targeted the convoys. The Luftwaffe, though weakened, still posed a threat to the dense, predictable lines of traffic. These drivers faced combat conditions without the designation, recognition, or weaponry of combat troops. The discrimination they endured was a constant, grinding reality. They served in a segregated army where USO clubs, post exchanges, and even blood supplies were separated by race. They faced open hostility from some white military police and local communities. In a bitter irony, the very supplies they were hauling, the rations, the fuel, the ammunition, were destined for a frontline army where they were not welcome to fight. They were the vital circulatory system of a body that often treated them as a separate organism. Despite this, their professionalism and dedication never wavered. They developed an intense pride in their work. A well-maintained truck, a perfectly executed convoy run, a record-breaking delivery time, these were their victories. They took the ubiquitous GMC CCKW truck and made it their own, christening their vehicles with names like Patton's Chariot, Jolting Joe, and the Black Panther. They forged a powerful camaraderie, a brotherhood born of shared hardship and a shared purpose that transcended the Army's official policies of division. The performance of these black soldiers on the Red Ball Express was a quiet, powerful rebuke to the racist policies of the U.S. military. Senior commanders, including the pragmatic General Eisenhower, took note. The success of the entire Allied advance in the late summer of 1944 was fundamentally dependent on the output of these segregated units. In after-action reports, white officers, often despite their own prejudices, were forced to concede the excellent performance and unwavering diligence of the black drivers and mechanics. They were achieving the impossible, and it was becoming increasingly difficult to argue that they were unfit for any duty. The legacy of these men is a complex tapestry of triumph and injustice. They were heroes who were rarely hailed as such upon their return to a still segregated America. They had proven their mettle not in a single, dramatic charge, but in the grueling, endless marathon of the Red Ball Express. They had kept the beast fed. They had fueled Patton's blitz. They had helped win the war, all while fighting a more subtle, protracted war for their own dignity. The thunder of the Red Bull Express was not just the sound of trucks, it was the sound of a contradiction at the heart of the American war effort, a roar of machinery powered by men who were proving, with every mile they drove, that they were equals in everything but name. The Red Bull Express was not a convoy, it was a geological event. It was a man-made river of olive-drab steel, a relentless, flowing entity that defied the fundamental limits of machinery, human endurance, and military probability. From the air, it must have appeared as a single, continuous organism, a serpent of dust and exhaust stretching from the heart of Normandy to the bleeding edge of the front. This river did not merely transport supplies, it performed a daily miracle of logistics, bending the physics of time and space to the will of the Allied High Command. It was a system that operated on the razor's edge of catastrophe, a high-wire act where a single broken axle or a misplaced landmine could trigger a cascade of failure. The scale of the operation defied human comprehension. At its peak, a truck was entering the Red Bull route every 37 seconds, day and night. This was not intermittent traffic, it was a solid, unbroken stream. The preferred workhorse was the GMC CCKW, the Juice and a Half, but the river was fed by tributaries of every conceivable vehicle, 4-ton max, 10-ton max, tankers, wreckers, and commandeered civilian trucks. They were loaded beyond their rated capacity, their suspensions groaning under the weight of artillery shells, gasoline jerrycans, crates of rations, and medical supplies. The drivers, mechanics, and military police who managed this torrent were engaged in a constant battle against entropy, fighting to keep order from collapsing into chaos. The enemy in this battle was multifaceted. The first and most constant foe was mechanical failure. These trucks were not designed for such a brutal, unending pace. They were driven flat out over cratered roads, their engines pushed to the red line for hours on end. Tires, the most vulnerable component, blew with frightening regularity. A blown tire on a narrow road could mean instant disaster, creating a roadblock that would stack up trucks for miles in both directions. The solution was their breakdown point. These were makeshift service stations established at key intervals along the route, where teams of mechanics worked in 24-hour shifts. Their work was not fine-tuning, it was battlefield triage. A truck with a seized engine was not repaired, it was ruthlessly shoved into a ditch and cannibalized for parts. The cargo was the only thing that mattered. Their mission was to keep the river flowing, even if it meant sacrificing individual droplets. The second enemy was the German military. Though in retreat, they were far from defeated. The Red Bull routes were juicy, predictable targets. German fighter bombers would occasionally swoop down to strafe the long, helpless columns. More insidious were the snipers and small bands of bypassed German troops who hid in the dense woods lining the roads. A single well-placed shot from a Panzerfaust could turn a gasoline tanker into a fireball, creating an impassable inferno. The drivers, largely unarmed, were sitting ducks. They developed a grim fatalism, knowing that their only defense was speed and the hope that the truck in front would attract the enemy's attention first. The third and most insidious enemy was fatigue. The drivers existed in a state of perpetual exhaustion. A typical run was a 300 to 400 mile, 36-hour marathon. They survived on coffee, cigarettes, and the amphetamine-based energy tablets officially issued by the army to combat fatigue. They drove through the night in near-total darkness, their blackout headlights casting a feeble glow just a few feet ahead. They navigated by mimizing the silhouette of the truck in front and the faint Red Bull placards. Sleep was caught in fits and starts, in the cab of a moving truck or during the brief, frantic loading and unloading at the depots. The line between consciousness and sleep blurred, and hallucinations were common. Men saw bridges that weren't there or drove off roads trying to avoid phantom obstacles. Yet, the river flowed. It was governed by a strict, merciless discipline enforced by the Rolling 20 Military Police Battalion. The rules were simple and absolute: maintain speed, maintain interval, no stopping. A broken-down truck was to be immediately pushed clear. The MPs wielded an authority greater than that of generals on this route. They became masters of improvisation, using jeeps to physically nudge disabled vehicles off the road and directing traffic with a ferocious intensity that brooked no argument. They were the immune system of the logistical body, identifying and isolating blockages before they could become fatal. The output of this chaotic, heroic endeavor was staggering. In its first month of operation, the Red Ball Express delivered over 135,000 tons of supplies to the front. At its zenith, it was moving 12,500 tons of material per day. This was the fuel that powered Patton's Third Army in its race across France. It was the ammunition that allowed the First Army to reduce the German stronghold at Brest. It was the lifeblood that turned a stalled offensive into a war-winning pursuit. The river of trucks was a testament to the American talent for organized chaos, a system that should not have worked, but did so with breathtaking efficiency. It defied the physics of wear and tear, it defied the enemy's attempts to interdict it, and it defied the human need for rest. It was, for 81 critical days, the most important highway in the world, and the men who drove it were performing one of the most vital, and least celebrated, missions of the Second World War. With the Red Ball Express now functioning as his iron lung, General George S. Patton's Third Army transformed from a stalled beast into an unleashed predator. The lifeline of gasoline, ammunition, and supplies flowing eastward was the metabolic fuel for his unique style of warfare, a high-velocity blitz that sought not just to defeat the enemy, but to annihilate him through sheer, disorienting speed. The late summer and early autumn of 1944 became Patton's masterpiece, a breathtaking operational ballet where the Red Ball Express was the unseen stagehand, constantly supplying the props that kept the performance from collapsing. This was the race to the German border, a campaign won not in headquarters tents, but on the dusty, congested roads of France, where the true weapon was the logistical certainty provided by a river of trucks. Patton understood his enemy's psychology. He knew that the German command, reeling from the Falaise pocket and the rapid liberation of Paris, was off balance and expecting a necessary operational pause for the Allies to regroup and resupply. Patton denied them this pause. His strategy was one of relentless, simultaneous pressure across a broad front. While his 8 Corps cleared the Brittany ports, a task he considered a wasteful diversion, his 15, XX, and 12 Corps drove eastward in a powerful, multi-pronged thrust. The German defense, expecting a concentrated spearhead, found itself stretched to the breaking point, unable to discern the main effort because, in Patton's mind, everywhere was the main effort. The Third Army's advance became a blur of captured towns and shattered German units. From the Seine, they crossed the Meuse River. They liberated Reims, then Verdun, places sacred to the French military soul and strategically vital for the push into Germany itself. Patton's tanks and motorized infantry moved with a pace that defied conventional military wisdom. They bypassed strong points, leaving them to be reduced by the follow-up infantry, a euphemism for mopping up isolated and demoralized pockets of resistance. The goal was always the next river, the next defensible line, always just before the Germans could establish a coherent defense upon it. The role of the Red Ball Express in this blitz was symbiotic. It was not a static supply line but a dynamic, responsive system that stretched and adapted to Patton's every leap forward. As the front lines advanced, new breakdown points were established, and the route was extended, sometimes overnight. The drivers, existing on a diet of caffeine and determination, found themselves pushing deeper into a landscape that was only nominally secure. They were often among the first American soldiers to enter newly liberated towns, their arrival greeted not by cheering crowds, but by the desperate urgency of forward supply officers who would swarm the trucks, directing the precious cargo to the units that needed it most. The primary commodity was gasoline. Patton's blitz was a voracious consumer of fuel. His armored divisions, his trucks, his scout planes, all ran on the 80-octane lifeblood delivered by the Red Ball tankers. The now famous scene of Patton standing by a roadside, watching his tanks sit idle for lack of fuel, was replaced by the sight of his columns constantly in motion. When a unit reported it was low on fuel, the response was not a question of if, but when the next convoy would arrive. This logistical certainty bred immense operational confidence. Division and corps commanders could plan aggressive maneuvers, knowing that the supply system, for all its chaos, would deliver what was needed. It was a stark contrast to the German experience, where every drop of fuel was rationed and every offensive was handicapped from the start by scarcity. By mid-September, Patton's forces had reached the Moselle River and were knocking on the door of the Third Reich itself. The ancient fortress city of Metz lay ahead, and beyond it, the Saar industrial region of Germany. They had advanced over 400 miles in a matter of weeks, one of the most rapid sustained advances in military history. The German border was no longer an abstract objective on a map, it was a tangible line his patrols could touch. This breathtaking advance, however, was about to meet its ultimate limit. The very speed that defined its success had stretched the Red Ball Express to its breaking point. The trucks were wearing out, the drivers were at the end of their endurance, and the distances had become so great that the system's efficiency was plummeting. Furthermore, the strategic priority of the Allied High Command was shifting. Operation Market Garden, the ambitious airborne assault aimed at crossing the Rhine in the Netherlands, demanded its own massive share of the limited supplies. The Red Ball, having fueled one blitz, was now being asked to support another, and the well was not bottomless. Patton's race to the German border in the autumn of 1944 stands as the ultimate validation of his command philosophy and the critical, war-winning role of the Red Ball Express. It demonstrated that in modern, mechanized warfare, the general who commands the most reliable supply line holds the ultimate advantage. The Third Army's blitz was not stopped by German arms in the field, its momentum was gradually slowed by the re-emergence of the very logistical calculus that had plagued it in August. But for a few glorious weeks, the river of trucks had fed the blitz, proving that with enough gasoline and willpower, an army could almost outrun the war itself. The thunder of the Red Ball Express faded in November 1944, its official mission concluded after 81 days of superhuman effort. But its echo would resonate through the remainder of the war and forever alter the understanding of modern military conflict. The race across France had delivered a stark and unambiguous lesson: logistics is not a supporting function of war, it is the decisive front. The Western Front was not won by the general who possessed the most brilliant tactical mind, but by the army that could consistently fuel, arm, and feed its soldiers at a distance and pace the enemy could not comprehend, let alone match. The legacy of the Red Ball Express is the story of how the United States, through sheer industrial and organizational might, made victory in Europe a matter of mathematical certainty. The most immediate and profound impact was on the German High Command. Their initial mockery of American materialism curdled into a stunned, helpless realization. They had been trained to see war as a chess match of maneuver and countermaneuver. The Americans had changed the game to one of economic and logistical endurance. A German staff officer captured after the fall of France reportedly confessed, "We could always figure out what you were going to do next. We just couldn't do anything about it. You always had another division, another 1,000 tanks, another 1,000,000 gallons of gasoline." The Red Ball Express was the ultimate expression of this reality. It was not a tactic that could be countered by a clever panzer ambush, it was a systemic advantage that rendered German tactical prowess increasingly irrelevant. They could win battles, but they could not win the war of supply. This logistical supremacy directly enabled the two most critical campaigns of 1944, the pursuit across France and the weathering of the German counteroffensive in the Ardennes. Without the Red Ball Express, Patton's Third Army would have ground to a permanent halt east of Paris, allowing the Germans to establish a stable defensive line along the Seine or the Marne. There would have been no race to the German border, no threat to the Saar, and the war would have stretched deep into 1945. Later, during the Battle of the Bulge, it was this same robust logistical network, honed by the Red Ball, that allowed the Allies to rapidly reinforce the threatened sector, famously turning the 101st Airborne onto trucks and rushing them to Bastogne, while simultaneously supplying the massive counterattack that sealed the Bulge. The ability to move entire divisions and supply sustained combat in the dead of winter was the direct legacy of the systems pioneered that previous autumn. The human legacy is equally significant, though far more complex. The Red Ball Express provided a powerful, if incomplete, catalyst for change within the U.S. military. The stellar performance of the predominantly black service units became an undeniable argument against the military's policy of segregation. How could an army claim that black soldiers were unfit for combat when the entire offensive capability of its most famous general had depended entirely on their skill, courage, and endurance? While full integration would not come until 1948, the seeds were sown on the dusty roads of France. The drivers of the Red Bull had proven their mettle not in a single heroic charge, but in a grueling, 3-month marathon that required more raw fortitude than many frontline actions. On a strategic level, the Red Bull Express codified the American way of war. It was a doctrine built not on finesse, but on mass. It accepted friendly casualties in exchange for overwhelming the enemy with firepower and mobility sustained by an unbreakable supply chain. This philosophy would define American military strategy for the remainder of the century, from Korea to the Gulf War. The lesson was clear: the nation that can project and sustain power most effectively across global distances will prevail. The Red Bull was the first, grand experiment in this kind of transcontinental power projection, proving that an army could be supplied over beaches, without ports, for hundreds of miles, at a run. Finally, the Red Bull Express stands as a monument to the unsung hero. The history of war is written by the infantryman in the foxhole, the tank commander in his cupola, the pilot in his cockpit. But the victory in Europe was equally won by the sleep-deprived driver fighting the wheel of his deuce and a half, the mechanic covered in grease working through the night, and the military policeman standing in the rain directing traffic. They won the war of the wrench and the wheel. They demonstrated that courage comes in many forms, and that the relentless, unglamorous dedication to duty is as vital to victory as the single act of heroism under fire. The Western Front was won not by a single general's order, but by the collective rumble of thousands of trucks, delivering the future one load at a time. The legacy of the Red Bull Express is the enduring truth that amateurs study tactics, but professionals study logistics.